Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Thank you so much for joining me. I am going to be talking tonight about small group instruction. In fact, I have planned for the month of October to talk about all things small group instruction. And tonight specifically, I'm going to be talking about how to group students and kind of what are the different ways that we can group our students in our classroom to get prepared for small group instruction, what kind of methods we can use, what are some of the ways that we can group them, and how that's going to look in our classroom so that we can more efficiently and effectively use that small group instruction, because we do know that small group instruction is a great way to help to support our students in our classrooms. However, with the event of small group instruction happening in your class, there is lots and lots of training that needs to happen to get them ready for that and kind of the dynamics that are going to be looking for. So it's certainly not a topic that I'm going to try to get covered all tonight. So I'm going to take all month to talk about all of the different aspects of small group instruction for the month of October. So again, specifically this tonight's episode is going to focus on how you can group your students effectively in your classroom. So if you are new to Teaching with Inquiry Live, and this is the first time that you are joining me, thank you so much for watching. My name is Patty. I am a junior grade teacher in Ontario, Canada, and I come live every single Monday night to talk about teaching and using inquiry-based teaching practices all throughout our teaching in all aspects of our curriculum. And I am also the teacher blogger behind madlylearning.com, as you see in the, right there, the bottom of the screen. So you can find me on all social media channels at Madly Learning. So thank you so much for joining me. The month of September for me has surely been a time where I have been getting my students ready for this moment. And that moment happens to be the time where I feel as though I am finally at a point in my classroom management routine, structuring their learning so that they can work on independent learning skills. So I'm finally at that moment where I think my students are ready to complete tasks independently so I can actually get some small group instruction going, maybe not for very long. And definitely I will still need to be monitoring, but it's something I need to start thinking about implementing in the next couple of weeks in my classroom. So thinking ahead as to how I'm going to group my students and what that's going to look like, as well as some of my own personal philosophies for why and how I do group my students, are definitely going to be coming into play. So we know that guided reading is effective. I know for sure that when I can have a small group of students and I have that targeted time for instruction, it also allows me to watch students, because remember, in a guided small group learning environment, it allows the students to apply some of the things that I've been modeling for them. It allows them to apply that in a small group setting where I can do a lot of observations. I have to say probably guided instruction is the place that the majority of my assessment is taken of students, especially my formative assessment, because it allows me to watch what they're doing, see how they're solving their problems. And because I'm doing a lot more watching than I am teaching, it also gives me the time in the moment to be recording down notes as students are working. So one of my major concerns, however, and it's always kind of sitting in the back of my head when it comes to small group instruction, goes back to my own days with as a student with basal readers, where the teacher had a box of books at the back of the classroom and they were all color coded and we were all put into groups, and I think they were like bird names or something. We were all in those groups. And every single person knew in the class that there was a link between how smart you were and what book you were reading from. And whether or not that was true or not, I mean, kids were mean, and the way that you were grouped often had a lot of stigma attached to that. So fast forward to my time as a teacher, I have a real empathetic mind for those students that are struggling with learning and struggling with learning needs. And I don't want them to feel like they are the students in the low group, because I find that is completely demotivating for the kids I probably need to spend most of my time motivating. So I really take time to think long and hard about strategies for how I could group my students so that I can avoid the stigma that often comes with some kids with working with the teacher or being pulled in a small group to sit at that guided reading table, the ability to ask for help, that the only kids that ever need help are those that are struggling. And if you're a smart kid, smart kids don't get help. So I really want to break that stigma down. And I use my different ways that I can group students to kind of add a little bit of confusion in there, and some ways where they might not always know the criteria that I have used to group students, so they don't necessarily see the commonalities that I might see, and I don't always make it explicit. So that's always in the back of my head about why and how I group students. So the very first thing I do before I even worry about grouping students is I need to have a set of data that I collect. So it doesn't matter how I'm going to group them. And I'm going to talk about four different ways that you can group your students in your classroom for small group instruction tonight. But before you do that, before you even get down to grouping your students, it's really important that you spend some time collecting data on your kids, because with more information allows you to pick better fits for which students should work with each group and why you're grouping your students differently. So some of the questions that I will often ask myself when I'm grouping my students are, what is their academic level of proficiency? So regardless of the subject, whether it's reading, writing, or math, and even social studies, those are in science, social studies and science, those are generally the core subjects where I'm going to be grouping my students for small group instruction. I want to actually know what their academic level of proficiency is, because this is going to be a factor that will probably help to inform my grouping decisions. I also would like to know students' interests, strengths, and needs as learners within that subject area. And I can take that information by doing student interest surveys on the subject. I can do a diagnostic assessment at the beginning of the learning to kind of get a benchmark for previous background knowledge and experiences with that topic. It also means that I need to assess things like learning needs and learning styles, and know a little bit about their learning skills and habits, because I certainly want to be able to mix up strengths and needs within groupings. I also definitely need to speak to other teachers or reading student records and know my students. By this point, I've got a month in, I'm kind of able to give a quick summary about the personality conflicts that might happen, which personalities should not be in a group together, which personalities can and cannot work together efficiently, because that's definitely going to be a factor if you've got those personality combinations that just are never going to be a good fit in groupings, especially this early on in the year. And I also want to look at why I'm grouping them. What is the purpose of my small group activity, and what is it that I am trying to accomplish? So what's the learning goal of perhaps that week's small group learning activity? And I definitely want to assess that learning expectation based on all of that other stuff. Now, I don't have ever a big, huge pile of papers, and it's not necessarily a ton of marking. A lot of this data collection happens kind of on the fly. I rely a lot on my intuition. I may take a quick assessment or snapshot of a diagnostic assessment where I've asked one or two questions in an exit card. I may be observing kind of interactions with students myself during whole group lessons as I'm doing the modeled and shared activities that are precursors to guided instruction. I'll be probably collecting a lot of in the moment data, and I honestly store a lot of that kind of in my head, and I really do trust some of my gut when it comes to some of that information and pairing. So once I have collected my data, the next thing I do to help me group, because I do group my students in multiple ways, is I actually make little cards. And don't worry, these are not actual students. I actually did a demo. I did a demo class because I have to be really careful about not using some of the things that I do in my classroom, just to respect my students' privacy and confidentiality and things like that. So all of the names you see here are literally the top 100 names of 2016, and I put them into a class. So in case you're wondering where these names and information come from, and then I took the data, the fake data that I collected, and based it on some of the teachers that I've been working with, that they've been sharing some of their typical makeup about what's happening in their classroom, and I kind of based it on those averages and percentages. So anyways, what I do is I get an index card for each student, and at the top I write their name, and then I will record some of my hard data that I have on them. So if this was looking at reading language centers, so if I'm looking at literacy centers, I've got these cards. I've got their name, I have their grade at the bottom. I modeled this after a split grade classroom. I have their DRA level from the previous year. So I was talking about these cards and how I record all of the information for students, including any special education needs, if they've got behaviors that I think is going to be aware, as well as their grade level at the bottom. So I lay these out on my floor and move them around to actually create my groups. And then I'll take those cards and put them back and write it out as a list. So I find that really helpful to see where students are and to see kind of the groupings happening in front of me on my floor. It allows me to visualize it. But the question then remains, how exactly do we group our students then? So if we've got students and we are grouping them, what are the different ways that we can group our students so that we are not always grouping them simply by academic skill? Well, the first way to group your students is actually by academic skill, and there is some validity in why we would do that. Generally speaking, the assumption being that students that are, say, reading at around an approximate same level of reading may all be struggling with a specific concept in that text. It also makes our planning for that small group instruction just a little bit easier, because it means that we are needing to pull one level of text as opposed to multiple levels of text, especially if we're looking at reading specifically. So there is definitely a benefit. It also gives us the opportunity, if we're looking at concepts where we will either need to reteach concepts because students didn't get something, or we'll need to review a concept so they kind of sort of got it, but we need to review it, versus whether or not they just need to continue along the path of where they were going. They got it the last time, or you've got students that you need to jump ahead. If you're pairing your small groups based on academic skill, because there's some reteaching and then there's also some that are more advanced, and you really have to kind of give those 4 different levels of small group instruction to a wider variety of students, then their grouping by academic skill is probably going to be the most efficient strategy to be able to do that most of the time. Now, I often, when grouping by academic skill, will not call them group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. I'll mix it up, and it's definitely not the only way that I group my students, but there are plenty of times in a week where that's exactly how I'm grouping my students, is simply by academic skill. It's easy to do, and it's less planning for some of those key learning activities. It's a lot less planning for me if I'm looking at most of the people at that academic level need the same type of instruction. The downsides of this grouping are is if this is the only way that you group your students, it stays pretty static, meaning that students that were initially assessed as being in your neediest group might stay in that group, and it might be hard for them to move beyond that group. It also is a factor of sometimes students need to be with mixed ability groupings because they need to be able to have conversations with people that might think differently, might approach something a little bit differently, or perhaps it's somebody that used to be where they were and now they're a little bit further ahead so they can learn from other people. Whereas if you keep all of the students that are struggling together, it's often harder to have, say, conversations where you want them to kind of learn within those conversations. So there is a time and a place for why you would want to group solely by academic achievement or academic skill, but there's definitely pros and cons to doing it, and I'm still definitely using groupings based on academic skill. In fact, I often will start my year because I don't have as much data as I would have in, say, May. So I will often use my groupings of academic skill are more often being used at the beginning of the year versus the end of the year. So that's one way that I will group my students. Another way I group my students is by grouping them based on interests and strengths. So this is where I'm looking not necessarily on overall achievement. So like level 1 students are all going to be grouped together and level 2 students, but instead I look at more of the skills that are required to achieve something. So if you're looking at reading, maybe instead of grouping all students that are reading at a level 20, maybe I would group my students based on who is struggling with fluency, or who needs help when they're decoding. They may be decoding and reading different level texts, but my lesson focus for that week might be on improved fluency. So I can group my students based on that skill and not necessarily on their achievement level of their reading ability. So then I can have a bit more of a mixed ability, mixed achievement grouping. I also will look at what they're interested in doing. So if I'm doing a guided writing instruction, then I may group my students based on interest. So if students are currently writing a report, I might have a group of my report writers or a group of students that are focused on that form of writing. Because I have a lot of flexibility in what form of writing my students are choosing, I can look at grouping my students based on, okay, who is currently writing a narrative? I can pull a small group and talk to them about the structure of the narrative form that they're currently focusing on as a whole group, of a whole small group. And then I can pull another group that might be working on, say, a simple story structure where they might be having a hard time adhering to a plot structure of their story. I may have another group which may be struggling with research skills, so I may pull them into a small group and focus the lesson that week for that group on research skills of those students and actually looking through that process of what that looks like and helping to walk them through that again and rehearsing and going over those same skills that I may have taught as a whole group, but now those students might just need a refresher or maybe the next step, or maybe they missed something in between and I need to go over that and do some reteaching with that small group. So that's where I could focus on interests. The other way that I could focus there, as I said, interest and strengths. The other flip side to that is really looking at, instead of looking at what the student is lacking, and where they are kind of falling behind, which is sort of what you're looking at when it's academic achievement. The flip side to that is looking at what is something that they're doing really well and something they're strong in. And again, this is something I'm often using either in social studies and science, or I'm using this in writing. So for example, in social studies and science, I may group students by their strength. So I may look at their oral language strength and their ability to express their opinions. And I might put a whole group of students that are really opinionated together so that they could have a debate. And I might put some of my other quieter students that have lots to say, but aren't really the boisterous, loud, kind of in your face kids. I might put them in a group together so that I can actually hear what they have to say, because they might not be overshadowed by some of those more opinionated and in-your-face boisterous students. So if I group them together where I have the shy, quiet students and it's just the group of them, then I might be able to actually get some information about their thoughts and opinions as an oral language without them kind of getting lost in the fold of the entire classroom. So I might group them based on kind of learning styles and strengths that way as well, depending on what it is I'm really looking for and what my objective is as the teacher for the piece of assessment that I'm trying to collect. Often the way I'm grouping students is going to be driven really by the data I've collected, the next steps I need to go, and what that learning goal is that I need to be able to target with my students. Another way to group your students, so not just academic proficiency or interests and strengths, but the other is to simply just look at personality and looking at grouping personalities that you think are going to be complementary. And this might even go so far as to look at a student's learning skills and group students together where you've got mixed abilities, not academically, but say learning skills. So you have some students that just are really good at persevering. Maybe they would be really great with somebody who might struggle with persevering, and they can kind of partner up on those strengths, and their academic might be a bit different, but they can draw on somebody else's strengths of learning skills to allow them to kind of function really well in a group. Sometimes if you've got a lot of really hyper kids and they're all in one group, they don't often get much done when they're in a small group. So you want to kind of mix that up and allow some of those personalities, if you think that those personalities would be really good, mesh together, but they might not necessarily choose that group. That would be a good time for you to give them the opportunity to work together with you because you think that their personalities would fit well and partner well together as well. So I like to do that, especially when we're looking at doing things such as even drama or oral language, or looking at where they need to have conversations and listening, and it's kind of more an interactive personality. Sometimes will allow me to group students in different ways. The next way is flexible groupings. Now, this is often the preferred way, is that we don't want to assign kids a group in October and they should be in the exact same group in June. That we do want the ability for students to be in different groups. So I do look at flexible groupings as two different ways, and I want students to understand that their membership within a small group isn't always going to be the same way. I think that students should work with different people throughout the year. So I do readjust what those groups look like at various points throughout the year. Every couple of months, we might look at how I'm just generally grouping, say, centers, rotations in groups like that. And I will change those up so that they have other people to work with. Even though this is the preferable way, that if you are reading any of the books or going to PD, often flexible groupings is going to be the preferable way, but there's often not a practical way that people explain how to really use flexible groupings in your classroom. So I tried to put that together and think of how exactly I practically use flexible groupings. So in my experience, I will do flexible groupings one of two ways. Number one is that flexible groupings don't often authentically happen in a rotation schedule. So I find it much harder to have true flexibility when I have them partnered and they're rotating through a schedule. So flexible groupings might be outside of a rotational schedule. And it also means that I can regroup students each week. So each week when I'm sitting down planning, I might decide what are my learning objectives for that week, and then I might pull out my handy cards and quickly regroup students based on needs. So if I have a class list that says, okay, which students understood like level 4, level 3, level 2, level 1 for the concept from last week. And then that will create my new grouping for the next week. And that will be, because it's constantly changing, it's a bit more flexible than kind of a static group that stays the same month after month. Another method is actually not to assign students to any group and allowing students to self-assign themselves to groupings based on their own self-assessments. So if you've ever asked students to self-assess their level of understanding for a concept you've just taught, then this is a way that students can put themselves in grouping by identifying how they feel about their knowledge of a concept that you just taught. So if you use like a stoplight system with red, yellow, green, and you can even add an orange in there if you'd like. But if you use a stoplight system where students will decide whether they get the concept really well, they understand it fully, they are almost there, but they need a bit more practice, they're so in their level of understanding. So that would be like an orange. And then you would have red is, I totally don't get it, I need you to reteach me. If after teaching a whole group lesson or even a shared lesson, if you ask your students where they are on that stoplight, they can self-identify what color they might be, and you can give them a marker. They can color on their paper and hand it in so that you can see it. They could even take a name card, you might have extras in the pack, put their name on the front, and they could simply just identify where they would be. If you had like a red pocket, a yellow pocket, a green pocket, they could identify which level of understanding they could be, and that could be an exit card activities. They just put their name card in the red, yellow, orange, or green pocket, and from there you can then build your groupings because your students are identifying what group they should be in. So if you've got 5 kids that are telling you that they're red, well, there's your first red grouping, and you can reteach that concept to those that are in the red. The green group can be left on a little bit later because they might not need you right away, or you could quickly meet with them and give them something more advanced to do so that you have more time later on to work with those that identified as being in red or orange. And as they're picking up the concept, they can always move their card to a different level so that they can kind of self-assess where they are on that journey, with the idea that they should be somewhere at the end in the top 2 of those color cards or color levels that you have. So flexible groupings can either be something that you're changing consistently based on previous data collected, or it can be something where your students can be the ones that are self-assessing with you monitoring a little bit, of course, because you don't want everyone to just constantly be putting it in green. But you want to teach them how to self-assess. And if they're accurately self-assessing, then they can be making up their own groups. And then you have student responsive groupings. It's flexible and you're really kind of meeting the students' identified needs. And it's a great metacognitive assessment piece too. There's also random groupings. And let's not fault grouping students just randomly. Sometimes you just need to group them and you have no idea how to group them. So mix up your cards, count to 6 and randomly assign students groupings, flip them over, make some small tweaks. If you've got some, if you had, say, all of your kids with behavior intervention plans are sitting all in one group, you might want to mix that up after the randomness, but it's random with a little bit of perhaps adjustment at the end. But if you have random groupings, there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's quick, it's efficient. You can kind of see what you're doing, and it really depends on what your learning expectation is for that small group. But there's nothing necessarily wrong with just randomizing the whole matter and just seeing kind of how that all lays out, if you think of it that way. If you think of another way that you can multiple group ways. So sometimes you might want to have 3 different systems of grouping, and they're just static and standard so that your students know how you want them grouped and you don't have to keep making it up. You've got 3 automatic ways. that you can group them. So let's say if you're looking to group students, one way you want to group them is through academic ability. The next is you want to group them simply just by personality or randomness. And then the third, you might want to group them by interest or strength with, say, learning skills. So you want to group them in those three ways. Well, you can use a system where you can give each student, say, a code, and that will be assigned what kind of group it's going to be. So for example, if you've got 25 students in your classroom, you can put them in 3 different groups. To start, choose 5 random colors and assign all of your students that are really struggling or are academically lower, your level 1 students, assign them all to be in one colored group. And then all of your level 2 students are in another colored group. Maybe your 2 plus 3 minus students are in the third group. Your level 3 students are in a fourth group, and your level 4 students are in a fifth group. And give them all color coded. Then you can look at mixing them up by personality. And now the students will have a color, but now you can give them a letter or a shape group that they could be in. And then again, you can look at the third way you want to group them, and you can give them a number. So for example, this is something from one of my math centers. This is the 2D geography package that I sell on TPT. But in here, there is a one way, because there's a lot of groupings for that group of lesson plans. So one of the things that I did was put this together. And if you look at this here, you have each one of these cards would be handed out to students. So all of the blue group could simply be your academic level. And then you have the circle group. So that could be perhaps your personality, where you're just mixing personalities. And then the numbers could even be just a random grouping. And if you assign students each one of their, when you're deciding to group your students, you say, okay, I'm going to meet with the circle group today for math. Everybody that is a circle group, so that's the blue 1 and the yellow 3 and the green 4 and none of the people in orange. But you can group those people in your classroom a little bit differently. So you can then call, okay, I want all the 1s. So that means you also have the ability to do kind of expert groups and home groups as well. So you can kind of come up with your own code that would be related to that. So that is one way that you could assign 3 different types of groupings to one student, and you could then use them interchangeably without having to constantly regroup your students. And sometimes that's easy. It's an easy and quick way to group them. Lots of different ways that you can group your students. Which way is the best? There's really not a best way. And the best way is going to be different from your classroom. From this year to next year, it's going to be different from your classroom to my classroom. It's going to be different from your classroom to the classroom next door. The grouping and the ways you group your students is going to be based on your assessment. It's going to be based on the data you collect, and it's going to be based on the kids that are in your classroom. The way you group your students is going to really come down to your professional judgment and what you think is going to be best for your classroom. Because in reality, the expert on what's going to be best for your students is you, because you're in there every day, you see them, and you can trust your gut to get it one way. And the best part is if you group them wrong once, it's a really quick fix to group them differently another time. So you group them, you go with your gut, you make a choice, you pick which way you think is going to be best, you play it out. If it doesn't work, you do something differently the next time. And it's not a huge loss if you made a mistake and grouped them differently. So I would really say that look at the different ways that you could use flexible groupings. Use your gut and your professional judgment on which way is going to be the best for your kids. There's no right or wrong way to do this. It's just what's going to work and what you've got time to manage and use in your classroom. And all of them are valid ways that you can group your students for small group learning. So I made a video on where I walked people through how I used these cards, as well as how I grouped people into my literacy centers and how those were rotated through. So I will post that to my main Facebook page tomorrow so that people can watch that video, and you can watch. I'll explain to you how I put these cards together and then how I use them to group my students to rotate them through my literacy centers that are in my classroom, up and running now. Now, coming up later on in the month when we're talking about flexible groupings, next week we're going to be talking about small group instruction and how planning and assessment is going to work. So how do you plan for small group instruction in math and language, as well as how to record your assessment data through small group instruction. We also have later on in the month, we're going to be talking specifically about guided math and what small group instruction in a math classroom looks like, as well as guided reading, because that's probably what we're most familiar with. But what does guided reading look like specifically at the junior level, because it's a bit different from what you see in primary. And finally, we're going to dig in a bit deeper into how we assess and how our assessment informs our instruction, further instruction in small group learning by the end of the month. So that's what's coming up all month of October, is we're really digging into small group instruction. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them in the video below, and you can check out the blog post that goes along with tonight's video. It's up live on www.madlylearning.com, titled Small Group Instruction, How to Group Your Students. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week where we dig a little bit deeper into the planning of small group instruction in your classroom in math and language. Thanks so much for joining me, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.